Good morning and good afternoon to those of you out there. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Funding for Crime Victim Services, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the National Congress of American Indians and the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. My name is Chia Halpern-Biso, and today I will be monitoring your questions. If you see here on the right-hand side of your screen, the GoToWebinar has a little box here for you can or ask any questions. And we will conduct a poll shortly, and the poll is there on the right-hand side. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I will try to monitor those and get to those as soon as possible. And today's webinar is going to be given by Virginia Davis from the National Congress of American Indians and Jerry Gardner from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. So we are going to provide an overview of the new funding opportunity for tribal victim services programs and answer questions from the audience here. So I would like to start with a poll today, and I'm going to ask if you've attended the last webinar that we held on July 10th. So if you can go ahead and please select yes or no. I think just a few of you haven't answered. If you could go ahead and answer, that'd be great. We're almost there. It looks like, let's see, almost everyone has answered, and it looks like about half of you, about 57% did not attend, and about 40 of you have attended. So I will go ahead and close that right now, and we'll move on. So about a little more than half of you did not attend the last one. All right, so this is a new program administered by OVC at the Department of Justice, and we have the solicitation available here. If you click on this link, we will send the webinar slides out after the webinar is over today. And OVC did host a pre-application webinar on June 8th, and it was recorded and is available online here. And I'm going to turn this over to Jerry and Virginia now.
Thank you, Chia. This is Jerry Gardner. I wanted to add to what Chia mentioned also is that we also have the tape and the PowerPoints from the July 10th webinar that we did, and those are also available. And we'll try to do a follow-up with everything and provide that to folks. I think first what we intend to do today that's a little different is that we want to, there's a couple things. One is that we are going to go over much more quickly the basic requirements and like. So if you want more detail, the PowerPoints from the OVC's webinar and from our prior webinar have more information, but we figured because a number of folks would have already been at the first webinar that we're not going to cover everything. We're just going to cover the basics. And then what we wanted to really focus on for this webinar is 3 different templates that we, and by we I mostly mean Chia and Virginia, have developed some very helpful templates. There's 3 different templates that we'll talk about later. There's a template for a tribe that doesn't have anything in place for victim services, a template for a tribe with some victim services, and a template for a tribe that has significant victim services and wants to expand upon them. So figure that tribes are at different places in what they would looking at to fund under this solicitation. So there's 3 different templates, and we'll spend time going through those templates and then also provide time at the end for questions and answers. So we're planning not to go into as much detail as we did in the prior one about the solicitation itself. But just the basics, the timeline, it was released June 22nd. It's a 2-phase application process. And so the first phase, which is all that's required by the August 6th deadline, is designed to be a streamlined, simple application process. And though the solicitation is almost 50 pages long, it actually is a very simple process of what you really need to submit for this early period, for this phase 1. And so we want to kind of highlight those things and highlight the pages the sections in the RFP that you want to look at. Then the second part will happen is that the tribes that have applied will be notified by September 30th if they're invited to submit a phase 2 application. And then over the course of the last 3 months of the year, be putting together those phase 2 applications. Those will be more detailed applications with full budgets and those kinds of things. And that would be due by January 3rd or January 4th. And then the grants would begin on or before April 15th of next year. So it's a little ways down the road to getting access to the funding because it's a 2-phase process. But making the requirements for phase 1 is actually relatively simple. And the next slide. The next one, and who is eligible to apply. So, and this is covered in more detail in the solicitation or the RFP, that it's federally recognized tribes. It can be tribal consortia, 2 or more tribes. And third is tribal designees. So tribal designees is a non-tribal entity that the tribe is authorized to apply on its behalf. And only one application per applicant or per tribe. And there's some illustrations on the first page, on page 1 of the RFP. It says, for instance, that each applicant must submit only one application. Any applicant, tribe, tribal consortium, tribal designee, may include multiple projects in their application that address their victim services needs. And the illustration they provide is an applicant may propose to hire a victim advocate in the police department, a child forensic interviewer in the Child Advocacy Center, and pay for sexual assault medical forensic exams for adult sexual assault victims. So that's just an illustration of that there could be different things, different positions and different things funded in different tribal departments, all under the same application. But it needs to just be one application. Next slide. The basic details, it's a 3-year grant period, and it would start on or before April 15th, 2019. So for some people, it could even start on April Fool's Day, 2019. The award period, the award amount is generally up to $720,000 for the 3-year period, but there is a provision that you can ask for more funding, but you need to provide adequate justification. So there is an option to request more, but you would really need to provide strong justification for that. There's no match required, and of course you don't want to include a match at all, because then you get committed to doing the match. The use of funds is very specific here. It's more restricted than those that might be familiar with OVW funding because of the nature of where OVC funding comes. But it is a wide range of programs, activities, equipment, supplies that can help tribes to develop, enhance, sustain, or procure victim services. And this is the first reference we're making to Appendix A. Appendix A is really one of the sections you really want to read in detail. It's very detailed and very helpful. And so we really want to encourage you as we go through, and we'll be making frequent references to Appendix A. Next slide. And this is just an illustration. I'm not going to read them, but these are different kinds of things. This is not all the things, but it gives you an illustration of some of the different things that can be funded under crime victim services. So it can be a victim assistance program, it can be legal services, it can be traditional, cultural, or alternative therapy, it can be code development, as long as it relates to victim services. So it's a range of different things that can be funded here. And again, check out Appendix A for detailed information on permissible costs and things that are permissible under this program. Next slide, and this is just kind of looking at it in a different way. This is, as you go through the different steps, the kinds of things that can be funded, and this fits in with what we're looking at later on the templates, is that a tribe that doesn't have a victim services program in place is likely going to want to start with the needs assessment and with strategic planning. So the needs assessment is assessing the victim services needs of the community. Strategic planning is developing a plan to meet the needs of victims. And then program development, the actual the developing of the programs and the implementation. And then for tribes that already have crime victim services programs in place, it's program expansion. So it's expanding the types of services that are provided, the population served, or the types of crimes addressed. So those are all kinds of ways of expanding. And the third template in particular will focus on those issues. But so the expanding population served may be to expand to elders or to youth. Expanding types of crimes addressed, maybe expanding beyond domestic violence and sexual assault to child abuse and elder abuse, and to a full range of different criminal actions. So there's many ways in which you can expand, and that can all be funded here. Again, on this one, there's some details, a little bit more detail on each of these on page 6 of the solicitation, and then of course in Appendix A is much more detail. Next slide. This is an illustration of allowable costs, and this is looking at it from the way that those of you who are familiar with Justice Department budgets and most of the federal government budgets, of looking at the different kinds of categories. And again, Appendix A is very helpful because Appendix A goes through and tells you what is and what isn't fundable, and it goes through in the same kind of process here of following the different budget categories. So first, salary, the personnel, fringe benefits, travel, which is staff travel in this instance, and then equipment, and the range of different equipment is allowable here. But again, Appendix A has much more detail on what is and isn't. That tables, but not picnic tables, you know, those kinds of things. Facility costs, rent, utilities, maintenance, renovation, those kinds of things. Although construction in this particular grant, like a number of Justice Department grants, the closest you can get to construction is construction paper, and also, you know, the maintenance and the like, but you can't do new construction. Supplies, and it goes through some of the illustrations of supplies, emergency or short-term needs of victims, operating costs, subcontracts, indirect costs, all of those things can be justified here, but it has to be justified as improving victim services. You need to show the connection between what you're proposing to do and crime victim services. And there's a lot of information in the both in the solicitation and in the templates that we can talk about with regard to that. But the link to crime victim services is crucial.
Jerry, this is Chia. We have a couple questions, and I'm not sure if you or Virginia are able to answer these. And if we can't, I'm sure we can get the questions over to OVC, but I will go ahead and ask them, and we'll see what we can do. The first question says, you said travel for staff. What about travel for victims, such as in Alaska? That is the only mode of travel. What category?
Yeah, this is Virginia. I would also put that in travel. That's absolutely a cost that sorry, I'm trying to go back to that slide. That's absolutely a cost that they anticipate. And, you know, if you've looked at the solicitation, one of the examples that OVC has provided in the solicitation relates to contracting with an aviation carrier in Alaska to transport victims to wherever they need to go for services or treatment. So yeah, I would put that in the travel category, and it's absolutely permissible.
Yeah, and those are, as Virginia indicated, those really are all permissible. It's just making sure that you cover it in the right category. And again, Appendix A is helpful. Chia, were there more?
Yes, we have a couple more. After Phase 2 is approved, can budget line items be reallocated to other line items if the budget is not used?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the normal rules for budget modifications in a DOJ grant will come into play. And usually the way that works is that you need to submit, you know, this is assuming after your award is in place and you've gone through the whole application process. If, you know, a year into the project, you realize that, you know, it took you longer than you thought to hire someone, so you're not going to spend down the salary line or something like that, and you want to reallocate those funds to travel or something else, training. You know, there are some specific rules about whether or not you need to submit a budget modification grant adjustment notice to OBC, but that's a pretty easy thing to do if it is required, and that's something that you would talk to specifically with your program manager after the award's in place. But there usually is some ability to move around funds to make sure that you can spend them. They know that projects don't always go exactly as planned, and that sometimes things cost more or less, and there's usually flexibility as long as you're trying to do something else that's also permissible under the program. Jerry, I don't know if you have more to add to that or a different take.
I agree with everything. I think I would just add that I think this phase 1 application is unusual. I don't remember seeing it before, where all you have to submit at this point in phase 1 for the budget is the figures for each category. So you don't have to list who all you're funding under personnel. Or you're basically listing a figure for how much you want for personnel, for fringe benefits, for travel, for each of these different categories. All that's required for phase 1 is to just put those figures. But I think that with the question, shows that it is helpful if you can and if you have time. The best practice is to go ahead and do a full budget, even if it's not required at this point, because then you'll be able to have your figures that you give as close as possible to what you're actually going to need. So we certainly recommend doing, if you have the time and are able to do the full budget. But what is technically required for phase 1 is only the total figures by category. So it's a very different kind of, it is a streamlined process in that sense. But for phase 2, you're going to be required to do the standard budget that you would for any other Justice Department grant.
Thanks. We had a follow-up question regarding the Alaska travel, about what category, and it says it wouldn't be in the subcontract because in the example it says contract.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think it kind of depends. Yeah, I forgot that Alaska specific example, I didn't have it in front of me, but you're right. It does say enter into a contract with an aviation carrier. Yeah, and in that case, you might put it under subcontract. For most folks, I think outside of Alaska, it wouldn't be, they would more be paying, commercial flights as they come up, right? So it would be more of an expense like that, rather than actually having a contract in place for a certain number of flights with a private aviation carrier like you might do in Alaska. So yeah, if it fits under subcontracts, I'd put it there. I also think that if you don't get that 100% right in your phase 1 application, that's not going to be something that they kick you out for. It's more something that they will then work with you on, I think, in phase 2. So I think, and at the end, the other thing I would say is if you're really kind of having trouble figuring out where to put a particular expense in your application, we'll have a slide at the end of the PowerPoint with a contact information for how to reach out to DOJ to get some guidance on something like that, so you can make sure you get it right.
Thanks, Virginia. We have a couple more questions here. If we have no, yep.
I was just going to add that in addition, and it does get confusing in terms of what goes into travel, because you assume everything would go into travel, but it generally is staff travel, but it can also be, for victim service travel. But in subcontracts, you'd want to, if you're bringing trainers in or people that you're using as consultants, that generally their travel would also go in contractual. But again, like Virginia said, it can be shifted back and forth if you end up with the wrong category.
Thanks, Jerry. Let's see. If we have no close access to businesses that lease mobile homes, can we purchase one?
Yeah, my understanding from reading the solicitation is it's very clear that you can that trailers and mobile homes can be purchased. That's not just leased; they can also be purchased. I'm trying to get to that section. It's in Appendix A under Equipment, which is on page 37 of the solicitation. it says that trailer or mobile homes purchased to serve as a location for the provision of victim services would be an allowable cost under equipment. It then cross-references to the contracts section for if you're going to be leasing a vehicle or a mobile home or a trailer. So I don't think there's, I think either option, either purchase or leasing is listed as an allowable cost in the appendix.
But also keep in mind that they do include unallowable cost examples too. So it's important to read both columns as you go through.
There's a follow-up question for what budget line would a mobile home for shelter go on?
Well, based on what I was just looking at in this solicitation, I think if you were purchasing it, they contemplate that it would go under equipment. And if you're leasing it, they contemplate that it would go under contracts.
Thanks. Here's another question. Can't do construction, but can you do architectural drawings with these funds we then use to obtain other funding for construction?
Ooh, that's an interesting question and not one that I have encountered before. So we can reach out to OVC, and I would also encourage you to reach out directly to OVC. And then if we get the answer, we'll share it with everybody on the list. But Jerry, have you come across that one before?
No, I don't know the answer to that one. I think, it does make clear that you can cover, maintenance renovation, I guess. But if you're creating an entire new structure, that's an OVC question.
I would, if I were writing a grant proposal and was trying to get it covered, I would talk about it as part of my strategic planning process.
That's a good one, yeah.
We have a question. Please explain maintenance renovation.
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is there's supposed to be a comma. It's supposed to be maintenance, comma, renovation. So I don't know if that clears up the question.
Thanks, Virginia. One more question here. Can a house in tribal housing be rented/purchased?
Well, I think it can clearly be rented. Virginia, can it be purchased?
Well, this is an interesting question. So by who?
Yeah, and everything needs to be connected to victim services. And for instance, they do explain that it can't be just for law enforcement activities. So you have to be careful in looking at it here and making clear who's going to use it. But go ahead.
It's the question's from Bernadette Hicks. Should I unmute her and see if she wants to?
Sure. I mean,
further?
The other thought, and as you guys can tell, and this is exactly what we had anticipated for this call is we're kind of doing some thinking out loud as you ask your questions. And so Jerry, the other thing that's in my mind as I hear the question is wondering about the extent to which the tribe can pay the tribe for tribal housing, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like would it be viewed as supplantation? And so that's why I was asking by whom. I mean, I think if you've, are we talking about like a designee who would be a separate entity from the tribe? Or are we talking about the tribe?
I am going to unmute Bernadette. She said she wanted to use it for emergency housing for victim services, but I'm going to unmute her and see if she wants to. Bernadette, we have you unmuted if you.
Hi, Bernadette. Can you give us any more information? I mean, you're basically, I understand that you would use it for emergency housing, and is the idea, can the tribe pay rent to the tribal housing authority to have use of one of the units for a shelter or emergency housing for victims? Is that kind of what you're thinking? Chia, do you think we lost her?
Maybe. Yeah, it says she's unmuted here, but okay. Well, I will just, yeah, we'll just move on to some other questions for now. Someone is replying. She said, grantees cannot rent from the tribe. This is considered double dipping. We've been told repeatedly we cannot pay rent to tribal housing. She said, I've been asked that by our CTAS purpose area grantees. So it sounds like she's had some experience asking questions.
Yeah, I mean, and that was that's what I was, that's what I was asking, if, you know, if we're potentially, if it's someone else, right, so that it's not viewed as, right, the tribe using this grant to pay themselves in a way that would, as you just called it, double dipping. So my guess is that is the answer, but I think it is still worth, if someone is reaching out to OVC with that specific question to figure out if there is a way to structure it.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. We have a question. Someone wanted to know if there's examples of maintenance and examples of types of renovation.
Are those more OVC questions, Virginia?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm looking really quickly in the, to try and find that section of the appendix to see if they gave any examples. I'm not finding that section right immediately.
For utilities.
Oh, here. So in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I did just find it. So under maintenance, they say, maintenance of shelters or transitional housing units such as lawn mowing, snow removal, janitorial or cleaning services. Those are some of the examples they give there. This is on page 41. And then, renovation costs. It says procuring services necessary to complete renovation, remodeling, maintenance, and repairs to a facility that will be used to house, for example, a child advocacy center, or domestic violence shelter, or transitional housing services. So I don't know if that's helpful, but those are the examples they give. If you have a question about something specific, I think it'd be worth reaching out. That same section also talks about crime scene cleanup, which could is another thing that you can use it for. Yeah, sorry, Jerry, go ahead.
There's an additional note on page 42 in the other category that just talks about for utilities and maintenance that the cost must be reasonably apportioned if they also support non-grant activities. So if the maintenance or the renovation is a shared facility, then you are only allowed to fund under this grant the portion of it that covers crime victim services. So if the space is shared with law enforcement or something, you wouldn't be able to cover that portion.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions popped up just now. Can funds be used to provide raises to current employees who haven't had one for a while to retain staff, or would this be disallowed?
I know for OVC that issue has come up more in the can they cover overtime, which is another issue. And I believe that we've heard over time that OVC allowed for the covering of overtime. For raises, I don't know. Virginia, do you have an idea on that one?
I think that, so one thing, in the, under personnel in the appendix, they specifically talk about annual cost of living increases. So I do encourage, if you're building in a new position, that you budget for annual cost of living increases. That's clearly permissible. I think, and performance-based salary bonuses are also specifically listed as permissible. It says, to the extent that such salary increases are generally available to all personnel of the grantee organization and consistent with the organization's established policies and procedures. Now, obviously, a bonus is different than a raise, but I think you could, absolutely. I mean, I would be, my guess without, having clear guidance in the appendix on this is that you could upward adjust the salary for the people that you are building into the grant and use these funds to give your employees a raise. Although I suspect that OVC will want to see that that's reasonable. What it talks about under salary in the appendix is that compensation paid must be reasonable and consistent with that paid for similar work in the organization. So if you're going to try and do this, I think you want to justify it as, that you've had retention issues, that people have been underpaid, that this raise would bring their salaries more in line with the market. Or things along those lines. I don't know, Jerry, if you found anything else.
No, I think the one thing I would add, though, is also another way of approaching it would be to indicate that you're asking them to do increased duties, that you're asking them to take on additional tasks that directly relate to crime victim services. And so that could be another way of justifying an increase, is to say that we're that now with this program, we're expecting them to do this, this, and this that all affect crime victim services that they weren't previously expected to do.
Okay, we have another question here. Can we designate funds to cover a contractual agreement with a non-tribal housing entity for rent expenses for crime victims while they are receiving victim services?
I would assume that's permissible, wouldn't you, Virginia?
Yeah, I had a little bit of trouble hearing Chia, but yeah. So Chia, will you repeat it? Make sure I got it right.
Sure. Can we designate funds to cover a contractual agreement with a non-tribal housing entity for rent expenses for crime victims while they are receiving victim services?
Oh yeah, I think that should be permissible. Yeah, I mean, that sounds to me like kind of squarely the kinds of stuff they're contemplating.
Okay,
I think
great.
you would need to explain why. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think you would probably want to explain why they needed housing. Like what would be is this emergency housing? Is it transitional housing? Is it that they need to be housed? That the services are geographically distant, right? Or anyway, you might want to explain a little bit more about why housing is a necessary piece of the puzzle to meet the needs of the victims.
Thanks, Virginia. Another question. Is a mobile home limited for victims, or would we be able to purchase a new office with the funds?
I think that you could use it for office space too. It doesn't say that specifically in the appendix that but the appendix is not claiming to list everything you can do. It's just trying to give some examples. And the example they give is that a trailer or mobile home to serve as a location for the provision of victim services. So that's they're not even saying housing for victims, right? They're saying like as a location where you might be providing victim services. I'm not sure what you are thinking about doing in the office space, but as long as it's an office related to meeting the needs of victims, I think it would be permissible.
And
the one thing I've heard OVC say is that a trailer or mobile home has to stay mobile. If it has to, there's some line that gets crossed at some point when there are too many improvements around a trailer or mobile home that it becomes more like a permanent structure. And so if it may be worth getting some more guidance from OVC about that if you think depending on what you have in mind.
And the other thing that's also indicated in the budget information is that if some portion of it is used for that doesn't directly involve victim services, then you just have to apportion it.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. Can the grant be used to increase food budgets for shelters?
Yes.
Okay, another one here. Does renovation include window replacement, flooring replacement for an old domestic violence shelter?
I would assume so.
Yeah.
Jerry?
I would assume so, yeah.
Okay, here's another one. Can we use the funding to construct a wheelchair ramp for our shelter?
I would assume so.
I would.
But I do think, you know, on that one, the federal government is weird. So I would on that last one, well, on any of these questions, I think it's always a good idea to reach out to OVC directly. On the ramp, I will also reach out to them about that. I would assume that that's permissible. But I don't know if there's, I don't know where the line is between what they consider construction and what they consider renovation.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. Could the funds be used for a mobile child advocacy center?
Yes. The funds could be used for a mobile child advocacy center or a not mobile child advocacy center, assuming you had a place to, you know, a building or, you know, a location for it. But yeah, child advocacy center is absolutely the kind of thing that is contemplated.
Okay, here's just a couple more. Is it allowable?
There's also, for whoever asked about the Child Advocacy Center, we can share this resource, but one of the things that DOJ often does is they'll put out, you know, kind of redacted examples of past successful grant applications, which can be really helpful as you're preparing. Obviously, since this is a brand new grant, we don't have any of those. That's why we developed the templates that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But as we were working on the templates, I did find some old redacted successful applications from OVC for a similar grant program they did in the past. And one of those that I found was about establishing a child advocacy center. So if anybody would like us to forward that link, if you're thinking about child advocacy centers, there is you know, a past successful tribal application that addresses that issue that we could share with you.
Virginia, is that in the CTAS examples or is that somewhere else?
Yeah, it was in the CTAS example from 2016 package.
Because that would be one to look at. I was just thinking if it wasn't a place to look would be for the purpose area 7 is the most applicable here. The purpose area 7 is the of CTAS is the OVC Tribal Victims Assistance Program, and so it has some the same general restrictions and issues. So those would be useful illustrations. I think last time I looked at the CTAS examples, unfortunately they're all in, at least the last time I remember looking at them, they were all in one big attachment, and so you have to go and make it through purpose areas 1 through 6 before you find 7. So it's one of those where it'd be helpful if you could attach them, get them individually, but those, as Virginia said, those are incredibly helpful. And so if you want illustrations of the successful funded OVC programs, that's how those are a good place to look.
Thanks. We have another question here. Is it allowable to use grant funds to pay medical support, care of last resort, including mental and/or physical therapies necessary as a result of crime?
Yeah, medical costs are allowable under certain circumstances. Usually, when there's not another, not some other way to get those costs covered. And obviously, you know, as with all things, it needs to be related to the victimization. And yeah, you can find more information about that in the appendix, but those would be permissible.
Okay, there's just a comment here. She said, I don't think OVW would allow them to do work under OVW paid staff for OVC purposes. I fear people are getting misinformation when it comes to mixing funds with another grant. It will cause them some major headaches in timekeeping and share costing.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that if you've got, especially, I mean, I guess, right, if it kind of depends on the setup, but if you're using 2 different grant funding sources to cover a single person's salary, then you will have to track their time and accordingly, right, and figure out how you're billing each grant. And I think, and I'm not sure if the person who was asking about raises had in mind that they were going to be, maybe you had an OVW funded advocate who you were trying to give a raise with OVC money, but I do think that would raise some, it could get complicated doing it that way, and I think you might want to reach out to OVC or OVW and talk that through if that's what people had in mind.
And the same goes for if the facility is being used for both different grants that would need to be apportioned. But I think it also is important to keep in mind that there are, one of the challenges is that the OVC and OVW funds come from different funding streams with different restrictions. So there are things, and we'll get to this in the next slide, is that generally OVW funds can be used for things like prevention, but OVC funds can't because it comes from the Crime Victims Fund and there's restrictions there. So there, that when you do start mixing those together, you have to be very careful because there are some things that can be funded under one agency's funding, but not under the other.
Okay, it looks like that's it for the questions. I do see a raised hand from Karen Artichoker. I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Karen. You want to ask your question?
Well, I think it was answered. So great job, Virginia and Jerry, and I really appreciate you doing this. So keep on trucking on. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And hopefully everyone, I was just saying.
Now we get to move to the next slide, which is the thou shalt not. The unallowable costs. And here I'll use one shorthand just to keep in mind that may be helpful, that generally said over the years that you can't fund, and there's additional ones here, but the three primary things you need to keep in mind that you can't fund with OVC funds are the 3 Ps: prevention, perpetrators, and prosecution. And so if you can keep those in mind, those are give you a general guidance. That and these, the issue here, as I mentioned, is because these are coming from different funding streams. So this funding is VOCA funding, which is the Victims of Crime Act funding, and it has legislative requirements. It's not that OVC is arbitrarily saying you can or can't do this, but because of the funding stream where it's coming from, there are limitations. And so one of the biggest ones is just crime prevention, that's generally fundable under a lot of OVW programs, but it is not under OVC programs. Services for offenders or perpetrator things that generally cannot be funded with OVC funds. That sometimes an illustration is that that OVC is used is that you can fund the community to prepare for the eventual return of the perpetrator, but you can't fund the perpetrators preparing to return to the community. So the services can't be directly for the perpetrator. It can relate to things that, but it can be for the perpetrator's family, and like it can be for preparing the community for the perpetrator's return, but it can't be directly for the perpetrator under this funding. And it also can't be directly for the law enforcement or prosecution. It can't be for construction or purchase of real estate, for lobbying, for fundraising, or for grant writing. And those, if you want to take a look in more detail of these different issues, there's first a paragraph on the bottom of page 6, which kind of goes through these very quickly. Page 6 of the solicitation, and then of course it's in great detail in the right column of Appendix A, and so that's where you get more information on each of these. And then here's the overall idea of what is required to apply. And we'll go over these in more detail, but it's basically all that's required is first is a program narrative, which is only 48 pages long, and Virginia will go over that in a minute, and you'll find information specifically, and these are the pages you really want to focus on the solicitation, pages 9 to 11, or what go through in detail what they need in the program narrative. The preliminary budget is on page 11, and the various appendices. But the preliminary budget is basically just, and I think it's also laid out, Appendix B has, which is on page 46, just listed, this gives you the basics for what's required for the preliminary budget. And it's just personnel, a figure, fringe benefits, a figure, travel, a figure, and the like. And so that's all that's required, but you're in the best position and best practice is to develop a full budget so that you have the basis on which you came up with it, and to save that budget so you can find it when you have to do phase 2. But for phase 1, all you have to do really is just the overall figures. The third one is the standard form 424, and that's explained on pages 11 and 12 of the solicitation. Then there's the financial capability questionnaire on page 12. And again, for those who've applied for Justice Department funds, you probably completed this a number of times. All you have to do is, I guess, upload the previous one, but they do require you to submit one with it, with this. And then finally, there's a tribal authorization, and that's only if it's a tribal designee. So if the tribe itself is applying or a tribal consortium, you don't at this point need a tribal resolution or tribal authorization. But if it's a tribal designee and not the tribe itself applying, then you do need to complete the tribal authorization. But those are all that's really required at this point. So it's very very basic in terms of the requirements for phase 1. For phase 2, you're going to need much more detail. But for phase 1, which is what's due August 6th, this is the basics of what you need. And then, Virginia, are you going to cover the next slide?
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the program narrative, which I think of as kind of really the meat of your application. Please keep asking your questions, raising your hand as we go. We want to be helpful to you, so we can interrupt this at any time to go back to answering your questions. But the program narrative really has these 5 parts: a tribal overview, a current state of victim services in your community, description of the issue, and then your project design and implementation. And then they want you to address whether or not you have a current application for CTAS pending. So that's not asking you, we can talk about it in a minute, but it's not asking you if you have any existing CTAS awards. It's really just asking if you applied and have one pending. Okay, so Jerry's mentioned a couple of times that TLPI and NCAI have put together 3 kind of sample application templates. We did that, as I was just mentioning, we usually like to ask the agency for past successful applications to share with folks so they can see a sample. But since we didn't have any this time and the application was so different, we tried to put them together just for folks who were would appreciate that as they're getting started. You can find those 3 templates. There's in the control panel for your webinar, you'll see a place that says handouts. And if you, in those templates are all uploaded, and you should be able to download them from there. We'll also email you after the webinar concludes and include those as attachments there. Obviously, these are just samples. They're not the only way to do things. They're probably not even the best way to do things. We were trying to make it simple. We hope that they're useful to some of you, and we hope maybe they'll give, stimulate thinking for some others and give you some ideas. But we would encourage you, not to cut and paste. It won't go over that well with OVC if they're getting a lot of identical applications from the tribes, and it won't tell the best story that you have to tell from your tribe. I also, I can see who's participating in this webinar, and I know we have a lot of really savvy, really experienced grant writers who have been working with federal grants for longer than I have, and I'm sure that you guys are working on things already that are more sophisticated and better, and I would encourage you to just stay the course, but we wanted to share these in case they're helpful. So like Jerry said, the 3 templates, they're each different. And I would encourage you to look through all three of them. We tried to weave in different kinds of activities, you know, just to have more ideas out there in the three different templates. I'm going to walk through just one of them right now in the PowerPoint. You can see, you know, tribal overview. That's the first section that you need to include in your project narrative. That's really where you're describing your tribe, what the demographics are like, what's the population in your service area or on tribal land, you know, kind of how's your government structured. You can see that in this sample that we made up, you know, we have a tribe of 4,000 enrolled members, 1,500 of whom reside on the reservation. The total reservation population is about 2,000. We're talking about a reservation of 10,000 acres, located 150 miles from the nearest big city, with an unemployment rate of 50%. You know, we've suggested a paragraph where you would explain kind of the basic government structure. In our hypothetical tribe here, we say they have a criminal court. If you do have a criminal court, this would be a place where you could include your average annual caseload. To the extent that you have data about the types of crimes that your court is seeing, that would be great. If you don't have that, you know, you may have information from your social services or child welfare departments, your ICWA office, that would be interesting and worth including here, that paints more of a picture. You know, we also included here that the tribe operates a tribal police department pursuant to a 638 contract with the BIA. You know, if you have it, some information about the average number of calls per month could be interesting. You know, the most frequent types of calls they're receiving. And in our made-up tribe, the health services are a direct service provided by IHS, and you could obviously say more about that here too.
And Virginia, I would just add for the, you might want to, in putting these sections together, if you have a recent demographic profile from one of the CTAS applications, including the current one, that you can find, you know, a lot of that information, you know, detailed information. There's different questions and but that could be a very helpful place to start with in putting the section together. Is to go to the most recent demographic profiles from CTAS.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that, Jerry. I meant to mention that and forgot. So yeah, absolutely. That hopefully you've got this written up in various places and it's pretty easy to do. The second section gets to the state of victim services, and we took this example, as Jerry mentioned, from a hypothetical tribe that really doesn't have much that they're doing for victim services at the tribal level right now. And so this example basically just says that, right? We don't have anything in place for crime victims. They're usually referred to the local county for victim services. Most of the victims aren't seeking services there. You know, you could, if it's the case that you really don't have anything going on at the tribal level to try and meet the needs of victims, you might want to include whatever else you can figure out about what the services, how far, you know, what the nearest services look like, and a little bit of an explanation about why the fact that they're that the non-tribal domestic violence shelter that's 60 miles away doesn't work for your community. So that's the state of victim services section. So the next section is description of the issue, where the OVC is asking for you to describe the specific victim services and assistance issues that you have, so like the crime problems, other conditions. One thing we've done here, you can see it on this slide, is in the templates we've included some of the national level victimization data, just to kind of the big picture context, especially knowing that it's often hard to have a lot of tribal level data. So you can feel free to use whatever of this you want or think makes sense. But this page is really just kind of trying to summarize what we know nationally about victimization rates, right? And what we know is that more than 80% of American Indians and Alaska Natives will experience intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or stalking in their lifetime. And we know that children are at a heightened risk, and that the trauma is having a real impact on Native populations, particularly Native youth, leading to high rates of substance abuse and suicide and all kinds of other issues and challenges. So you can see at the end of this section, it says, while these statistics are drawn from national data, they also accurately reflect the experience of victims in our community. So one way you could approach this section, if you don't have a lot of, kind of data, hard data about the situation in your community, is to include the national level data, and then just kind of talk about what it's like in your community. Talking about yes, we are seeing high rates of suicide. We are seeing high rates of domestic violence, or whatever else the problems are that you're focused on in your application. This again goes back to the hypothetical tribe we were writing this up for, and they say, we have a variety of crime victims in our community: women, children, men, elders. For too long, they've had to seek assistance outside of the community, and many have gone without any meaningful access. It talks about, last year we had over 300 domestic violence related calls to the tribal police department. We have no tribal shelter. Last year there were 35 reported cases of elder abuse. So whatever information you do have, you can include here, and talk about the challenges, what you think the unmet needs of the victims are in your community.
And Virginia, I would also add, I think it's really important here, as it is with CTAS, is that there may be a huge number of different issues that you have in your community, but the issues you want to focus on here are the issues that you're going to use the funding to address. So you don't want to spend a lot of time on issues that you're not funding or you can't get funded. Here, the focus of this section should be on identifying the issues that you're going to address in the program, with this program and with this funding.
And then the next section in your project narrative is going to be your project design. So this is the what are you going to do with the money section. And you may recall, those of you that were on the last webinar, or anybody who's read the solicitation, OVC includes 3 specific examples in the solicitation for this section. And I'd encourage you to look at those again. Those are also helpful and give you a sense both of, some of the things that OVC is clearly saying are permissible uses of the funds, but also gives you a sense of kind of the level of detail that they're looking for. So for this template, we said, that the tribe would be conducting a community needs assessment. In our hypothetical world, we're talking about a tribe that's just getting started, so that makes obvious sense. I would also encourage all of you, one thing, this is a big new program, right, that we're talking about today. It's $110 million. And we hope and are optimistic that money is that's going to become annual funding, so that we're going to have, a $100 million program that's being distributed across Indian country every year. And hopefully that'll really allow tribes to build out the crime victim services infrastructure. But one of the things I've been thinking about, I think it's worthwhile for folks that are applying this time around to think about is what kind of infrastructure at the tribal level can you put in place now with this first round of funding to help make sure that you're ready, and have kind of your projects identified in the pipeline and things kind of coordinated, assuming that there's going to be, that this funding opportunity is going to be an annual funding opportunity, for the foreseeable future, right? So it may be that even if you're not getting started, that it might make sense to do a needs assessment, even if you're farther along, to do a needs assessment and to bring together some kind of standing group, interdepartmental tribal group that is charged with kind of identifying victim services needs on an ongoing basis, or strategic planning, since we think there's going to be a considerable amount of new resources, and so we can kind of try and get that infrastructure going at the tribal level to be in a good position to apply for next year's funding and the year after, and going forward. So anyway, in this template, we're talking about conducting a community needs assessment, hiring one full-time victim project coordinator who would assist a community team in developing a strategic plan for victim services in the community. That team would include all the relevant stakeholders from the tribal health department, law enforcement, prosecutor's office, the court, child welfare, behavioral health. This tribe is also proposing to purchase and furnish a trailer home that can be used as temporary housing for victims, and also to purchase a car to drive victims to appointments and services as needed, and for the project coordinator to visit victims in their homes. Also, the necessary equipment to get a new employee up and going, and then finally they're talking about sending key members of the community team to trainings where they can learn how other tribes are addressing the needs of crime victims.
Virginia?
Yeah.
We had a question. Is there a related conference that must be included in the budget? And I think
nope,
yeah, nothing specific, right?
That's right. There is no. I mean, not that OVC has told anybody yet. I know oftentimes DOJ grants require a certain amount of money be set aside for training or certain conferences be attended, and OVC hasn't. It's I suppose conceivable that they would add that in phase 2, or that we may see that down the line, but this solicitation doesn't provide any guidance or instruction or seem to require that.
So we would certainly recommend that people do include money for it. And one of the illustrations we've talked about was because of the nature of the funding, we wouldn't really be able to, if you're going to the OVC Indian Nations or Victims of Crime conference, that for this year's conference, you wouldn't be able to get the money in time. But over the course of the 3 years, it's the 2020, December 2020 conference that you could potentially include funding for that. Though OVC had suggested that if you do that, you want to indicate who would be going and what the connection with crime victim services and like are, and what they would get out of the training. So that's just an illustration of one of the places where you might put it. But there's many other trainings, from the Women Are Sacred conference to many other things. So I think it is helpful if you can is to include some budget for staff travel.
Thanks. We just had one comment. Michelle Demert made a good comment. She told tribes that have had a tribal court assessment to use that tribal profile to quickly create the information about the community.
Thanks. That's a great suggestion. I'm going to pause for a second. I have been emailing OVC and got some informal guidance from them on a couple of the questions that we asked already. So first was related to architectural drawings. The informal response from OVC is they're skeptical that is a victim service, so it would likely not be allowable. In terms of whether or not you could build a ramp to make the shelter accessible, the response I got is that you can definitely attach a ramp. It's possible that that building a ramp, that at some point you cross into construction, depending on how you're doing it. So I think that one takeaway from that is I think there is a way to add a ramp and make your shelter accessible, wheelchair accessible, but there may be like kind of ridiculous restrictions. You need to buy a more expensive prefab one rather than constructing one to avoid running afoul of the construction prohibition. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this, just again, a reminder that I'm walking through one of the 3 templates. The project design for the other 2 looks different, includes, several other possibilities of ways to use the money. And then the final thing you need to include in your project narrative that you'll see in the template is a CTAS duplication check. And the question is whether you submitted an application for victim services through the FY 2018 CTAS in either purpose areas 5, 6, or 7. And that can be a simple, sorry, that there's a big typo in this slide. That should say we did not submit a CTAS application for FY 2018. So if you didn't submit one, then that's all you say there. Or if you did, you would say something similar to what the second option is, which is we submitted an application for victim services through purpose area 5. In that application, we requested funding for maybe it's a full-time victim advocate to be housed in the tribal prosecutor's office. And then the key is to say that an activity that complements rather than duplicates this application.
And for those of you who haven't memorized the purpose areas of CTAS, Purpose Area 5 is the OVW tribal government funding. Purpose Area 6 is OVC Children's Justice Act or child abuse funding. And Purpose Area 7 is the general OVC Tribal Victims Assistance Program funding.
And again, what OVC is really worried about here isn't any existing grants you may have. They're worried about pending applications you may have, specifically in CTAS, because those award decisions haven't been announced yet. In phase 2, they'll ask you a more detailed question about other federal funds that you may have and how they interrelate. But for right now, they're really just asking about whether you have a CTAS application pending in those 3 purpose areas.
Virginia, we have a quick question here.
Yes. Great.
Okay. Would fencing for the shelter, which holds families, including small children, be allowable, or would that be construction?
I am not sure.
It might have to be.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's a question that I would encourage you to put to OVC.
But it could be just subject to the same kind of thing as long as you purchase the fencing and aren't creating it.
Yeah.
And we have one more question. Would we include that we currently have or are operating under Purpose Area 5, even though we are not waiting to be funded? We are in the middle of a grant.
So they're wondering if they would include that?
Yeah.
I think that you do, I'm trying to get to that section of the solicitation. The instruction is to state whether you submitted an application for victim services through the FY 2018 CTAS. That's all they want to know. So I think that you do not need here to talk about an existing grant you have that you got through something other than the FY 2018 CTAS. It does say at the bottom of page 10 in a parenthetical, a more comprehensive disclosure of funding received and pending applications covering all federally funded grants or cooperative agreements must be submitted within the 12 months, was submitted within the 12 months preceding your application for this program will be required in phase 2. So for phase 1, you just need to answer the question, do you have a pending FY18 CTAS application for purpose areas 5, 6, and 7?
And I would say in that section, you don't want to mention, you might in the course of what you're proposing if it works in conjunction with that program, but in the section here where you're addressing the CTAS and pending applications, you probably don't want to mention the ones you currently have to confuse the issue. So you don't want that to be highlighted for OVC where they might confuse it and think that you're talking about pending applications versus a current program.
Yep. Okay, so then on this page you can see the imaginary budget that we've put together for this template. Again, it's just the high level. It's the rolled up numbers. It's not a detailed budget at all. You want your budget to be reality based, meaning that you want to really be trying to accurately account for the costs to do the things you've said you're going to be doing, but you don't need to provide detailed breakdowns of calculations or justification or any of that. And again, in terms of you'll see that the total of what we've proposed here adds up to $620,000 for the 3 years of the grant. $720,000 is the kind of the soft cap that OVC has put out there, but you should ask for what you need to do the project that you're proposing. It doesn't need to add up to $720,000. It's fine if it's less than that. And if what you want to do will cost more than $720,000, you should explain that too and ask for what you need. But you really want to try and make your budget reflect kind of to the extent that you can, a realistic estimate of the cost to do what you proposed. Chia, are there more questions?
Not yet.
If not, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No questions.
Okay, then I wonder, is Michelle Demert still on? I was going to ask her if she would talk a little bit about some of the work they've been doing in Alaska to specifically help support tribes that are interested in applying in Alaska.
Yes, she is, and I am going to unmute her now. I did let her know we would be probably calling on her.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Michelle, you are unmuted right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Virginia and Jerry, Chia, for all the wonderful information. It's been very helpful. I really appreciate it. So the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center is offering to help with folks in Alaska, and I've created a template for Alaska-specific purposes in envisioning that there is not really a victim services program available. When I compared my template to Virginia, Chia's, and Jerry's, it's very similar format. And I just insert, like in the number 2, current state of victim services, I have a lot of information about just the crime situation and victim situation in Alaska specifically. And so that I pulled from either the Tribal Law and Order Act report or the Department of Justice report on, I can't remember, so Children Can Thrive chapter, and one other report. So anyway, I'm glad to share this, but I would prefer that people ask me specifically so I can be in communication with them. And so if you're from Alaska and would like to see a sample template, please email me at michelle.demert@aknwrc.org. So that's MICHELLE.DEMMERT@aknwc.org. And I'm sure Chia will put my contact information someplace as well. But we're super excited. Sounds like there's going to be a lot of great proposals out there, and our victims will be getting some services. So, hooray.
Thanks so much, Michelle. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for being willing to share your work and your contact info.
And the report that Michelle referenced is the advisory committee report on Native children exposed to violence, or the longest named advisory committee, the advisory committee of the Attorney General's Task Force on American Indian and Alaska Native children exposed to violence.
Great. So the slide that's currently up on your screen shows a bunch of resources that may be useful as you finalize your applications over the next couple of weeks. You've probably and if anybody on the call is just trying to decide whether or not to do this, I want to tell you that I really think this is a pretty straightforward application to pull together, and I think you've got time to do it. So really, I hope that you leave this webinar encouraged to get your application in and to make it happen. I think it may seem like a lot, but I think it's pretty straightforward, and hopefully the templates and resources and materials will make it easy if you're somebody who's just starting to think about this. But the first link on this slide is the OVC website, where they are collecting all of the resources. That includes, the solicitation, the FAQs, a link to the pre-application webinar that they did. They've actually also posted on the OVC website a link to the previous NCAI and TLPI webinar that we did, which covered much of the same material we've covered today. So you can find a bunch of stuff there. I would encourage you to check that out. I talked about this earlier. This slide shows who you can contact at DOJ with your specific questions. So the first, the National Criminal Justice Reference Service Response Center, that's who you want to contact with any of the questions about permissible uses of the funds, what you can or can't do, you know, so can we build a ramp? Can we do the architectural drawings? Can we pay rent to the Tribal Housing Authority? All of those questions would go here. The second, the GMS support hotline, which is underneath, that's the hotline if you're having technical challenges when you go into GMS to submit your application. So that's really important. You know, they're 24/7. So whenever you're working on this, if you run into problems, call them immediately. DOJ is pretty strict about their deadlines for applying. They don't tend to make exceptions if you run into technical difficulties, but they sometimes will if there's a record that you called GMS right away and we're trying to solve the problem. So not only, you know, so it's an important thing to do, and GMS is actually helpful and often can solve the problem. So you know, keep this contact information is also in the solicitation, but it's how you can get in touch with DOJ directly. And then here's contact information for Jerry and I. We are happy to answer any questions to try and help get, you know, if you need help interfacing with DOJ, we're happy to do that, but by no means do you need to have us in the middle of your work and trying to do it. You can also reach out to them directly, but we really, NCAI and TLPI are really eager to make sure that this really important funding gets where it needs to go and is serving, you know, to the tribes that want to improve services to victims in their communities. So if we can be of any additional assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to help. And Chia, do we have any more questions?
No, we don't have any more questions right now.
Okay. Well, great. Jerry, I don't know if you have any final thoughts.
Just as you've indicated, to encourage folks to apply. It's a great opportunity, and the phase 1 application isn't that complex, and there's certainly is time between now and August 6th for most folks. And we will be sending out sharing the templates with folks who've been here on the call. Feel free to share those with others, and we're probably also going to be able to send it out to the OVC Indian Nations Conference list. So we'll try to get that out broadly to folks to help in putting together applications. So we'll try and get that out to you all as soon as we can.
All right. Well, again, if you want to look in the handout section, we do have, as we mentioned, the templates, and we also do have a 2-pager, which just gives you the basic info. And I will email out a link to the webinar recording, the PowerPoint that you saw today, as well as the templates and the 2-pager. So I will get those out to everybody shortly. So thank you all for joining today, and feel free to email us with any questions. And have a great day. Thank you.